My name is Dr. Polo Nsubugachobe. I have been the chair or the coordinator of Advancing African Australian Agenda since its inception. And as you may recall, in 2010 we had a wonderful presentation by Kevin Rudd, and we've kept on this theme. The role, the importance of this forum is being to create bridges between Australian region and Africa, and we work closely with the African Union. I have taken this role for some time because from all of my academic life, I realized that we need to learn from each other, and we need to learn from those that know, so that they are able to help us to grow as we live in Australia and as we are ready to plow back to Africa. It's a wonderful occasion that we have these forums. We have to have 4 forums today. We start with the Advancing African Agenda, the families and the youth. It's an important occasion for the Africa Day because we don't only celebrate the Africa Day, but we use the platform for lessons so that we improve our settlement while we are here in Australia. The forum we have this morning is a wonderful forum and wonderful speakers that provide with experiences of their own. I don't want to tell you much, you will hear that yourselves. But most importantly, that we are facing 3 themes. We are facing the theme of transitions, the theme of resilience, and the theme of fighting corruption. And the theme of fighting corruption arises from the theme of the year for African Union. We are together to try to bring about this knowledge in a partnership of different organizations, including the Pan-African Australian Diaspora Network, which is growing in this region. Last year and the years before, PADAN has worked together, and we had the Chamber of Commerce, and we had some other agencies, including government. And this year, like a few years in the past, we'll be hearing speakers from the Department of Foreign Affairs, and then we'll be hearing speakers from the Victorian government. It's an occasion that we have to take seriously because the lessons we are going to get are quite significant in the way we settle in this country. And not only the way we settle in this country, but the way we may have to plow back to Africa if we are doing very well. I leave you to enjoy the day. It will be a wonderful day. There's more to learn. Enjoy your day.
I'm here to listen. I want the good ideas, and I know that there are enormously talented people. I mean, Mimi, I have enormous admiration for. People like Irene, involved in the Ethnic Communities Council. Those who are running ADA, people like Fred Alale, whose also talent has been recognised so much so that he was on the ministerial task force. The entire multicultural affairs is long overdue for a shake-up. If I do have an opportunity to be the minister, VMC is going to be more robust. It's actually going to be reinstated so it has its own strategic plan, its own budget and its own staff. And I want them to be on top of their game, not lagging 10 years. I want them to be bringing the best possible information and advice on strategy to the Minister of the Day, which I hope will be me. I also want reference groups that focus on specific issues, or even cultural groups, drawing on the expertise as well as on the ground evidence, so that we can come up with plans in a timely fashion, not wait 2, 3, 4 years whilst they are being crystallised and made. We need to be, if we're going to make a difference, we need to make sure that we make the decisions, the right decisions at the right time for the right reason. And in my view, if you make a decision that's 5, 10 years too late, it's not the right decision because it should have been made earlier. So in closing, congratulations. I'm really very keen to hear what contributions you make. You are enormously talented. What I admire about most migrants is that you're a self-selected group. sometimes driven by adversity, sometimes just by hope and aspiration, but you're a self-selected group in many ways. You have greater courage, you are risk takers, and hopefully greater drive to achieve great things, and that's why Australia is the nation that we are, and will continue to benefit from the migration program that this country is renowned for. So thank you very much for the opportunity of joining you today, and I'm listening with great intent to the ideas that come forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Honourable Inga Purich. As you can see, drawing from her speech, she is very excited, of course, and we are also excited to hear that she can connect or relate with us migrants. At this point in time, may I ask Dr. Mimi Watts to come up to the stage.
Thank you, everybody, and good morning. Welcome here today. And could I just say, can we give another clap for the two MPs who just spoke before? Because, yes. And I say that because it is not often that you have people who are not just politicians, but they're actually there for the community. Because Inga in particular, I see you every day, everywhere where I go as a multicultural commissioner. Your contribution, but your personal love for the African community is almost palpable. So we really applaud you for that. And Natalie, I know we cross paths here and there, so it's always good to see you again, and thanks for making it very early. I'm also going to acknowledge a very good friend of the African community from Victoria, please. Can somebody say his name? Andrew is a wonderful friend. Absolutely, absolutely. So all of you, absolutely, we give Victoria, please, another clap in our community, because as much as we can have all the visions, as much as we can have all the aspirations, I think we need other people to walk the walk with all of us. So it is not just about talking, it is about having that support from the various communities, but also from mainstream and other people who were here before us who have actually made it. So all protocols observed. Rather than go through the list, I want to welcome all of you here and also thank the VMC for asking me to represent here today. I got off the plane not too long ago after 4 weeks in 7 countries across 4 regions of Africa. So my talk is going to focus more on some of my experiences there as an African woman, but also as an African migrant going back onto the continent. What I like to acknowledge is the diversity of Africans, because when we talk about Africa and we talk about Africans, who are we? Do we really know ourselves? And when you look at this year's theme, a united, vibrant, inclusive, and integrated African-Australian communities, I think something that people know me very much for talking about is that Africa is 55 countries. I know people say 54, but Morocco has joined the family. Yes, after 30 years in the wilderness, they did come back. So yes, we are 55 countries. And when you look at those 55 countries, each one of them is so diverse. And what disheartens me most often than not is when we are treated as if we are just one Chinese community, we speak one language, because even within the Chinese community, there's a lot of diversity. Then what about a continent? And I think going back to Africa as the academic lead consultant for VMware in the USA really gave me a different perspective of Africa and how vast the continent is. And when you want to think about Africa from the geographical perspective, I want you to think about Australia like 3 to 4 times. That is how vast the continent is. I know historically the maps have distorted it to be this little place. And I think those are some of the realities that we have to think about. As Honorable Inga Riley said before, she spoke about the intellect and the capabilities that we have within this community. But what I have found as an individual is that we don't know about each other. Even sitting in this room, if you ask lots of the African people who meet each other almost on a daily basis, if you ask them what those people do, they don't know. Why? Because we have been colonized in the mind, and that colonization still remains. We look up and we always think if that person looks different to us and has a different color, then they are much more better than us. And I think it is something that we really need to start really rethinking and valuing what we have within us. We are not very good. The African people have not been very good. And when you even look at trade within our countries and amongst ourselves, it is easier structurally to trade in the northern countries rather than with the South-South countries. Historically, those are some of the challenges of colonization. But what has happened, and the implications is, us growing up, even though we are not from the generation of the colonizers, because most of us were born after the 1950s and the 1960s, and some of us maybe in the 70s and later, we, absolutely. So we came later, but our parents grew up with that mindset, and some of that has been passed on. But what I've also realized is that post-migration, the people who have migrated here, especially those who lived their childhood in Africa 20, 30 years ago, are living as if they are living back in Africa at that time. You must go to Africa and see the difference and see the shift. You know, cultures are made by man, and cultures do evolve. And I think it is important that we must evolve with those cultures, because it is enough and it is not okay to talk about what we want to do, what we want to achieve now. That's absolutely true. We need jobs. We need to create those opportunities. But I think the best challenge and what we need most as members from different African countries, because I look at it from countries rather than from communities. Because when we are talking about communities, we are thinking about people coming from one country, and then we talk about the different communities. People who are coming from different African countries, I need people to really start thinking about their mindset and the shift in thinking, about their capability. Because if you don't value you, how do you think that other people will value you? Most often than not, we don't value us, and we don't value each other. And having all of you in here this morning makes me really proud. Though, something that is lacking is some of the people that I would have loved to see here most, maybe they'll be in the afternoon session, especially the mothers, because we are evolving, but a lot of our people are still being left behind here in this country. And we really need to think about the strategies, because it is not about the same faces, the same people. It is about how do we have that representation across those regions, across the Africa that I think I know. And I give an example being in Western Africa. I spent time in Ghana, I spent time in Nigeria. And what was fantastic was the similarity, but the diversities within those two countries. They're different countries. Yet there was something that was really at the core. And I also found that in East Africa, in Kenya and Ethiopia, being education. I don't think people realize what is happening over there in terms of innovation. What people realize what is happening in the higher education sector, because historically during the colonized years, you found that most of our African countries had 1 or 2 universities. All that has been challenged, because when you turn around now in Africa and you look at the numbers of universities across every country. And I give an example like Ethiopia that moved from 2 universities only 20 years ago to now about 40 universities in about 15, 20 years. So that gives you a very good example of how education is still valued. But what I loved and what I've seen across the continent is the change in leadership, the youthfulness. We've still got the doyens, you know, the doyens as the older people, but there's a shift. Go to the different faculties, go to the different institutions. And I think one of the challenges that the African migrants face here is the whole idea of self-actualization, of opportunity. So having that comparison and seeing how youthful some of our leadership are, we need to also think, how do we learn from them? Because all good is not only here in Australia. We've got great opportunities. You know, we can never not appreciate what Australia has done for each and every one of us, and myself being an example, the opportunities that Australia has created for me. However, I think we should not forget what we have left behind, because I think there are opportunities there. And Africa is a continent that is growing. There's a lot of richness. There's a lot of capabilities. And that the skills that we have learned here, some of us should think about giving back over there, but also that there are things that we can go back and learn over there and bring here. So when we think about a vibrant and integrated and inclusive society, which is a theme that we are trying to celebrate here during Africa Week, I just want us to reflect how we are not only going to be leaders just here within Australia. Let's share that leadership back on the continent, but also let's go back on the continent and learn what they are doing so well, because there are lots of places that things are thriving. You'll be very, very surprised and see how they have done it. Think about the young people, innovation hubs that I came across. And in one of the countries, I had a group of women. We talk about cybersecurity, that we don't have women. In one country, I met a young woman in her early 20s. She's got a group of 250 women in cybersecurity. They're all engineers. So when we're thinking about innovation and talent, there is a pool of talent. And I know that that talent is also within us here. But it is also important that we recognize our own, we put them forward, we become inclusive, not just thinking of other people to include us, we must include ourselves first amongst each other. Another thing that I want to share quickly is participation. It's been really interesting, the shift in participation. And I know when we talk about participation, people always think about political participation. Here I'm thinking about participation in innovation. I'm thinking about participation in just building communities and building societies. And that was something that came very strongly to me across different areas. But the willingness of lots of the governments to actually put in the resources to encourage that participation. And I think with some of the new ideas and the document that has been released for the African communities here, I think it is something we can go back to such drawing books and say, how is it that they have done it, and how can we bring it here to Victoria, and how can we use that to benefit not just us here in Victoria, but other people beyond. Something that is still lacking amongst us is they say that if you want the African people to know something, they say sometimes write it behind the bottle of the beer. That's something I learned over there. Or put it on the radio. But if you put it in the books and in the policies, most people don't read it. And I think that's a challenge. Yet we have some of the highest intellectuals around the world. And what has happened? So we need to have the culture of reading and writing. And that was something that came across very strongly across the various areas that I traveled to, in terms of that contribution and participation and also knowledge generation. Yes, people in academia, we're going to generate knowledge, but what about civil society? So it's really important that we think about it. And just before I end and thank the organizers, I'm also going to invite and share with you that I've just written a book, Sahara. And it's not my first publication or anything, authorship, because as an academic, you publish or you perish. But this has been a very different shift. And I've just got the cover here for you people to see. And the launch is on Friday, the 25th at the Wheelers Center. And the title is called Sahara, Piercing the Taj Ceiling. I'm going to go into the book a lot more when we do the launch on Friday, and quite a number of people here that have seen the faces, have seen their booking registration. But when you think about piercing the Taj ceiling, it comes back to the theme of today, because when you think about the white woman and gender equality, we think about the glass ceiling. Is that correct? When we think about Asia, we think about the bamboo ceiling. And I thought, what about the black woman and the woman of color? That is where I coined the Taj ceiling, because people have asked me. And this is the journey of a migrant woman. It is not my story. It is a mix of so many stories, but I thought it was different to approach sharing messages in another way that were more inclusive and bring in people from different cultures. And anybody can be Saharan. If you know Africa, Sahara Desert, Sahara is the heart of Africa. So I just want to thank you people for making it on a very cold morning, and for being here today to celebrate Africa Day with us, or the Africa Week or month, depending on how you see it. And also to thank Rebecca, Fred, and Sheila, the president of Africa Day Australia, a very powerful woman that I admire intellect as well. So I just want to acknowledge all of you and say thank you for organizing today. Thank you for keeping this going. But I will not conclude with that, mentioning Mr. John Bellavance. John, this is where I say we need everybody to work with us. You are the brains behind Africa Day, if people don't know it. Do you want to stand up, John Bellavance? Yes, with your wife. And in Melbourne, because John is one of the first people who started Africa Day, and with his wife, Anne, they've been here and they've been the strength and the backbone, but the African brothers and sisters have taken over and they've taken the leadership, and I think that is what it's supposed to be. So I just want to acknowledge you and thank you, but all of you here in the audience, and thanks for making it here today.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, thank you for having me here to celebrate Africa Day with you. Over the last year, DFAT has witnessed some key milestones which I'd like to discuss with you today, not only in relation with our interest in Africa, but also in terms of how we interact with diaspora groups, like all of us here today. The framework for these changes lies in the latest foreign policy white paper, which was released about 6 months ago on the 23rd of November 2017. The white paper was the first comprehensive review of Australia's international engagement for 14 years and seeks to chart a course for Australia's engagement with the world over the next decade. Most importantly, it sets out how best to deploy Australia's resources in pursuing its interests and promoting its values. It gives the Department a strong foundation with which to drive policy. It shows that we can integrate economic and security agendas and connect domestic and international interests. And it took into consideration the views of not only government departments, business and other interest groups, but also the general public more broadly. The term white paper originated with the British government, and many point to the Churchill White Paper of 1922 as the earliest well-known example. And the importance of this document, which was drafted almost 100 years ago, was that it was an early tool of participatory democracy. In his foreword to the Foreign Policy White Paper and in his speech launching the paper, our Prime Minister noted that change, unprecedented in its scale and pace, is the tenor of our times. The simplicity of the Cold War is long gone. The world is a much more complex environment. And as the Foreign Minister said in her speech to launch the White Paper, while we cannot predict the future, we can be ambitious in seeking to shape the external environment and maximize our influence in our region. To navigate these changes as uncertainties, the White Paper stresses that Australia needs to build on its foundations, namely our strength and resilience at home, the hard and soft power that give us influence internationally, and the values that reflect who we are and how we approach the world. We have a number of strengths that we can draw on to achieve the objectives set out in the Foreign Policy White Paper. In particular, Australia is entering its 27th consecutive year of uninterrupted economic growth, a world record, and it's the 13th largest economy in the world. These are things to be really proud of. Australia is an open export-oriented market economy, trading our goods and services around the world. With over a quarter of Australians born somewhere else and more than half of us with a foreign-born parent, Australia is an open, diverse, and integrated society, and that's something that we've heard a lot about today. And it's this last point, excuse me, that's of particular interest to us here today. Chapter 8 of the White Paper, with its focus on partnerships and soft power, includes the important role that diasporas play today. And it says that it's vital that of what diasporas can actually help achieve and help us achieve in our international policy. And I think it's this context that I'd like to share with you and the perfect place to segue to our interest in Africa. We have diplomatic relations with all African countries, with posts supplemented by a wide network of honorary consuls, often run by experienced business representatives and often from the countries in which they work. In 2017, we opened our latest embassy in Africa, this one in Morocco, bringing our total to 9 missions across the continent. Our increased footprint, increased economic engagement, and increased people-to-people links is helping us to build bridges, connections, and gain a better understanding of the issues on the ground. Much of this is cemented by the role of diasporas. Partnerships between all levels of government, between the Australian government and business, civil society, and multilateral organisations are essential to effective foreign policies as they amplify Australia's international influence. They allow us to, at the state and territory level, promote and facilitate trade, investment, tourism, and education, to counter security threats and engage with globally connected Asian cities and regions. At the business level, they interact on global issues such as climate change and sustainable development, domestic economic reform, public support for open trade and foreign investment, and to promote our commercial interests. And these things are becoming more influential and are gaining more attention in places like Africa. With NGOs, the private sector and multilateral organizations magnify the impact of Australia's development assistance program. And most important to us today, with our diasporas, assist Australia to deepen ties with other countries, which are often the foundation of the points above. It is this mention of diasporas that is so significant, since this is the first mention of the importance of diasporas in a foreign policy white paper to date. Personally, this reference is incredibly powerful. As I said earlier, I was not born in Australia, and like you, I've made Australia home, and it's rewarding to see our contribution recognized. And in the context of our engagement with Africa, the diaspora can and often do play a central role. You are our doctors, our engineers, our teachers, our public servants. You are a vital part of the Australian community, and you are the glue that links us back to Africa, a continent that has such incredible potential. As the white paper states, Africa's projected population growth and rapid rates of urbanization and technological change place it firmly within our long-term thinking on how to pursue our global economic interests. The substantial footprint of our resource companies across Africa confirms that the resources sector will be the continuing foundation for our economic engagement. But we are also keen to build on this engagement and diversify our interests and links with Africa, to education, to agriculture, to renewable energy and infrastructure, all of which are solid matches between Africa's emerging needs and our own capabilities. A strong private sector delivers higher growth, more jobs, and also helps reduce poverty. And this is one area that you, as part of our African diaspora, can play a key role, linking and driving this continuing engagement. The African diaspora is also intimately involved in crafting our foreign policy for the continent. To recognize Africa's growing influence and importance globally, the Australian government created its advisory group on Australia-Africa relations in 2015. The group is chaired by Kasta Tungaraza, and its membership reflects the diversity of Africa itself. This group of eminent representatives from business, civil society, and the public sector informs the Australian government's thinking and policies on Africa and complements the work of the department in which I work. But I'd also like to talk a bit about my own personal engagement with the diaspora, and this is mainly the South Sudanese diaspora in Australia, most of whom are here because of the conflict that continues in their home country, and it's great to see so many of you here today. Although we have engaged with various South Sudanese representatives over the years, it was only in the last year that we undertook a more formal project that deepened our engagement with this particular community in Australia. South Sudan has been a foreign policy focus for Australia for many years, and we played a key role on South Sudanese issues while we were on the UN Security Council in 2013 and 14 in New York. It's also the only country in Africa where we have deployed Australian Defence Force personnel in the UN peacekeeping mission. Much of what I'm about to note will come as no surprise to most of you. Following the outbreak of violence in 2013, just 2 years after the independence in South Sudan, our South Sudanese diaspora in Australia fractured along tribal lines. As noted earlier, the violence continues with no end in sight, despite the attempts of the international community, most notably South Sudan's East African neighbours, through its high-level revitalization forum. As a result, our diaspora remains fractured today, and unfortunately, with the ease of social media and its reach to even the remote corners of places like South Sudan, comments that have been made in Australia have had the potential to spark further unrest thousands of kilometres away. Given the divisions within the South Sudanese community in Australia, it was recognised that there was a need to reach out to the community leaders together in a neutral space and to reignite peace-building activities and start a process of dialogue to rebuild unity across the community and also to rebuild the trust amongst community leaders that had been broken. And thus, our project was born with the aim to increase collaboration and effectiveness of diaspora-led initiatives aimed at peace and reconciliation both here as well as back in South Sudan. We continue to work with the diaspora to build trust, encourage peace, and urge the various groups to work together to strengthen their voices so they are heard here, in other countries that also host large South Sudanese diasporas, such as the US, Canada, and the UK, as well as back in their home of South Sudan. I'm excited by this work. It's innovative, cutting edge, and gives me hope that our diaspora here in Australia will be able to increasingly play a role in building peace in South Sudan. 10 years ago, it would have been impossible to envisage DFAT undertaking such a project, which was based here in Australia, working with community members. Our focus has always been outward. But the white papers provided the basis for me to reach out, make new friends, and meet new colleagues, and help play a role in what I consider to be such an important endeavour. This year, too, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade will celebrate Africa Day by hosting a lunchtime discussion focused on diaspora, a key to successful foreign policy. The panel will include Kasta Tungaratsa from AGAR, Fred Alale, who's here with us today, and as a young South Sudanese peace builder, David Vincent, who I'm sure a number of you in the room know. And I'd like to say, I think this is the first time that DFAT has ever probably celebrated Africa Day inside the department, and also focused a discussion on the role that diaspora can play in foreign policy. Thank you for listening to me and allowing me to share my history. And also, happy Africa Day for next week.
Hey, black child. Yes, I'm talking to you. Do you know who you are? Who you really are? Do you know you can be what you want to be if you try to be what you can be? Hey, black child. Do you know where you're going? Where you're really going? Do you know you can learn what you want to learn if you try to learn what you can learn? Hey, black child. Do you know you're strong? Strong? I mean really strong. Do you know you can do what you want to do if you try to do what you can do? Hey, black children. Be what you can be. Learn what you must learn. Do what you can do. And tomorrow, your nation will be what you want it to be.
I would like to invite Dr. Apollo to invite to the stage Professor Lindsay Farvey, who is from the University of Melbourne and chair of the board of the CGIAR Consortium and the ILRI. I believe Dr. Apollo will say more about Professor. He is one of the keynote speakers, sharing global knowledge and experience on the advancing African-Australia gender theme, and again suggesting opportunities on the Australia-Africa agenda. Dr. Apollo, please.
I think we are very excited that we have Professor Lindsay Farvey. We did meet in a situation like this one, and he was delivering a keynote speak. But what he said struck me, and after that I went and talked to him. I said, look, the level of knowledge you've talked to Asian people should be shared by the Africans. And since you live in Melbourne, I will welcome you to come and share the same level of knowledge. And I leave that one for you to judge when you hear him talk. Professor John Lindsay Farvey has enjoyed careers in business, government, and academia, and is currently the chair of the board of the International Livestock Research Institute, based in Nairobi, Kenya, and Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, with a total of 80 units across Africa, 16 across the developing world, and through the Global Consultative Group of International Agricultural Research, the CGIAR system, is also got 70 questions worldwide. He is also the chair of the International Livestock Research Institute, the ILRI. He has worked professionally in tens of countries, manages what was then Australia's largest international development consulting company, founded a business in Asia, and Australia, been the Dean and CEO of the Australia's largest faculty related to agriculture and published on social, ethical, and technical themes. He is a fellow of the Academy of Technology of Sciences and a life member of Care Hall of the University of Cambridge, and also serves on a board of a large Middle Eastern investment in agriculture in Australia. Retaining a professional title at the University of Melbourne, his credentials include, in addition to PhD, higher doctorate and an honorary doctorate. His personal interests relate to equitable development, integrating all aspects of human well-being. Please join me to welcome Professor Lindsay Fravey to the stage to deliver his keynote speech.
The African continent and the Australian continent share many environments, a lot of history. I don't want to mention the Commonwealth of Nations, but I just have. It is part of our shared histories for many of us. But is this the way that we've been doing things in the so-called development world? Well, let's just take one example, and this is an example taken from two other countries with some similarities to Australia. The graph is of one state in the United States, an unnamed state, looking at the cost of unfunded pension funds. It goes up to $8 trillion at current interest rates. That's all we need to see. It's money that doesn't exist to pay pensions for people in the future. So people that imagine we've got a wonderful system in the Western world need to think about how much of the Western world is based on an assumption of continued growth within those countries. The only way of having continued growth is technology and population. You have to ask yourselves whether the Western countries are going to increase both of those. The triangle, inverted triangle, the other side is Britain, with an unfundable future pension liability. These are things that we have to look at. So the simple lesson is, if we talk about what we can offer to another continent, such as Africa, we can't follow the richer countries just because we say the richer countries have got it right and we're going to copy that and catch up. The richer nations will be forced to become more sustainable in their own ways. Resilience actually becomes the same thing as sustainability in these political and economic terms. We've locked ourselves into short-term political cycles where we don't solve these long-term problems. So what is happening here that's relevant to Africa? Population and food are the main issues that we talk about when we talk about Africa. I'll concentrate more on food. Where does food come from? Most people don't see food this way. It starts with oil. The food that we eat today, the major foodstuff of the whole world, is cereal grains. That's the major food that we all consume. Cereal grains are effectively grasses. Grasses rely on nitrogen fertiliser, the way we practice agriculture today. Nitrogen fertiliser is overwhelmingly a product of the petroleum industry. Nitrogen from the air is condensed at a very low temperature that uses a lot of energy, and that energy comes from petrochemical plants. So here is a question about sustainability. How do we feed people if it takes approximately 1,400 litres of oil to feed one person for a year, multiplied by however many billion people we currently think we are in the world? So when we talk of sustainability, we have to talk about the ingredients of that and look at how we can address this for the future. And it's not all bad news. I'm not here to present bad news. I'm here to present how, between our two continents, Africa and Australia, we're coming up with solutions. So just a little bit more of what goes on in agricultural science courses. Some of the people here in this room have heard these things before. We have the oil to make nitrogen fertiliser, a major part of agriculture. The second most important fertiliser is phosphorus. Phosphorus is a mined resource. Mined resources run out. What the world doesn't tell us is that 70% of the world's phosphorus resources are in Africa. They're in or near Morocco. It's disputable about where it is, but they're in the African continent. It should be easy to transport those around Africa. And the third major ingredient of modern agriculture, of course, is water. And I'll talk more about an exciting development in Australia and potentially in Africa as a continent at the end of this. What is the ingredient that currently feeds us? Well, those three things do. The one that has kept feeding us for the last 100 years, or nearly 100 years, is the fact that technology produces a geometric form of growth. As long as we maintain the research, as long as we keep on solving problems, we're able to come up with new ways. That's why food gets cheaper all the time. Whether we believe it or not, food is cheaper every day. You look at the real price of what's received for grains or for other essential foodstuffs, it's a continuing decrease in price. This graph simply shows you the bad news that's trotted out all the time, that we're going to run out of food, which is the Malthusian from Thomas Malthus. Great idea, but he was talking about Ireland in a pre-industrial era with an exploitive colonial power. Population increases arithmetically. Technology is producing increased innovations at an exponential level, rising that way. Here is what's happening in a field overlapping with agriculture. This graph is about the human genome, but of course genetics work is pioneered in the agricultural sectors and is critical to the way that we do the breeding work, including genetic manipulation in much of our food already. Moore's line, the white line on that graph, was something postulated a couple of decades ago when it became clear that we were accelerating the rate of technological innovation, and it looked like a law for the computer industry, and we were all terribly proud about this. What has happened in the biological sciences is that it's even faster. The cost of sequencing the human genome has dropped like this. Following Moore's line, so everyone believed this is it, based plans on this, it's actually become even more cheaper. This is an old graph, it's now a lot cheaper than that. So if we go back to sustainable development and how that might be seen, we have here a statement from Jeffrey Sachs. Now Jeffrey Sachs is the Harvard guy who worked with the United Nations and of course the American government, but the whole world, to produce the Sustainable Development Goals. I'll talk about that next. In order to do that, we had to talk about what is sustainable development. Now, you've heard me say that we can just do things that are more sustainable all the time, and this statement tells us the dynamic nature of that, where it includes everything. The holistic integration of economic, social, and environmental objectives in an approach to scientific analysis, governance, problem solving, and human activities. Well, it involves everything, and the key word is integration. Integration is the only way we can approach these issues. In the past, we've created problems by saying this agricultural scientist can solve this problem, or this economist, or this road builder, or this social scientist. All of these things go together. They cannot be separated. The Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure everybody has seen many times, these 17 issues that the United Nations evolved to bring together the things that affect the whole world. There are two very significant things that I want to bring out about this. The first is that in the past we always thought the United Nations and development is about poor countries. This is about the whole world. Each of these relates to every nation, and each nation has signed up to them. Each nation that can sign up has signed up. It's a critical thing to realise, because what we're talking about is supranational activities, things that exceed what can happen in one nation. We can't entrust it, or we can't say that one government can affect things across the border. That's not how it works. But these issues transcend borders, they transcend continents, and that's why this has been a major breakthrough in saying this applies to all of us. This applies to Australia as much as it applies to any other country or group of countries, perhaps 55 in Africa. The second major point is that most of these things include what has been going on in the past, but it's enabled us to stop a number of development activities that really weren't that productive. Let me move on and talk about how development is working in the agricultural sectors. Health and well-being in the world, and particularly in Africa, is affecting marginalised people in a way which is way beyond what is being shown on television and so forth. It's easy to show things that are portrayed in a vision. The things we're missing is the hidden hunger, as it's so called. The hidden hunger is made up of two ways which we really need to address at the source. I was pleased to hear Mimi referring to the mothers, because usually it's the mothers that will have the most effect in this. The health and well-being of young children from the point of conception, not after birth, but from the point of conception, there is a need to have high quality protein which is almost only available from animal products, eggs, milk or other animal products. Without this, in the first 1,000 days of life, we have children whose mental capacity doesn't develop to full capacity, so the educational projects can't really work. First 1,000 days from conception through. The second thing is stunting, physical stunting, which leads to people having inadequate physical abilities. The number of people caught in these categories is increasing, even though absolute amounts of food in the world appear adequate. These are nutritional issues. So they're being addressed. Now, in a country like Australia, the things that are listed here are being implemented. Often when I talk to people, they say, oh yes, but this wouldn't be happening elsewhere in the world. It wouldn't happen in Africa, for example. Well, what is happening in development is this continuing leapfrogging of technology, where an idea that is thought up to be useful in one circumstance, somebody says, oh, I can use that in this other one, and there's a huge benefit. That means a number of intermediate technologies are really not needed at all. All of these are things that we use in agricultural science. Using satellites to track the photosynthetic rate of plants, knowing when a plant is under stress, being able to have monitors within fields that can turn on irrigation, using drones to spot spray weeds in paddocks so that we don't have to send out a big sprayer to spray everything but just target individual weeds. Now, of course, it's not on the farm that you'll see next door. This is on the big scale farms that are leading this, and they're not doing it just out of good-heartedness, but there's less pollution, there's more production, more reliable output. They're not doing it just for the benefit of people or the environment. They're doing it for profit. It makes money. These are the technologies that move out of agribusiness into development. It applies to livestock also. Tracing where one's animal products come from is probably more important than tracing where plants come from because of the aspect of food safety. Animal products pass on more dangerous diseases to us if they haven't been properly cared for. We can now trace an animal from what paddock, where it grazed, how it was treated, how it was slaughtered, was it halal, kosher or other slaughter techniques. We can know whether hormones were used or whether antibiotics were overused. We can know the welfare of that animal, and it can all be on a supermarket packet of meat or milk or on a carton of eggs. This information is good for the consumer, but it's also good for reducing the resources that are used in animal production. One of the interesting things that I can relate here is that just a month ago in Kenya, the President was speaking at one of our functions, and he was able to say that he will have electronic ear tagging of all cattle in Kenya mandated to start this year. Now, Australia's only just caught up to this. It's not that Australia is helping Africa with this. The idea was seen there, it was trialled, and it's implemented. Here it's taken us decades to go through the talking, oh, it's too expensive for this and that, and even now we haven't done it for sheep. Even in Victoria, where things are usually more sensible than the rest of Australia, perhaps, with all due respect to our DFAT colleagues. The Victorians had the opportunity to say, let's make this mandatory for sheep. They backed off because it would cost a little bit too much. Things happen in Africa faster than Australia. So how does this apply to Africa? I'm going to run through this very quickly. The World Bank has looked at this and said that these technologies are being applied faster in the developing world than elsewhere. We've got the fishermen using mobile phones. In Africa, SMS is used much more than smartphones. Technologies developed in Africa are ahead of anything in a developed country for health messages, for agricultural messages, using SMS in association with banking, insurance, and so forth. We don't have this in any developed country. We think smartphones are the smartest technology. What is really smart is to use a simpler technology that everyone has to a greater effect. That's what's happening in Africa. So these are the other things that come out of the World Bank report. This graph simply shows what I said there. What I'd like to move on to now is Africa and Australia specifically, continent to continent. So this is where one of those centres, the International Livestock Research Institute, has offices and research activities in Africa, 12 in Africa and others across the world. This is an attempt to show what Mimi showed earlier, that Africa is a lot bigger than Australia, three and a half, I think she said. So if you see the vague outline of Australia down the bottom and then you see it upside down the other way because it's the other side of the equator, this is an attempt to show overlapping environments in the two countries. What it doesn't show is this area in the middle, the highlands in Ethiopia and Kenya. The elevation actually makes the climate there similar to the climates that are in Australia. Australia is the only continent in the world that has these similar environments and a strong agricultural research industry. This is why it's so important for Australia and Africa to link through agriculture, food and all the related industries. There's a number of reasons why we should go through looking at how we look at livestock in Africa. This slide is usually presented to an audience that is not really favourably disposed towards eating meat, you know, the vegetarian community and so forth in Australia. So the reason it's here is to point out meat is critical both for health and well-being, as I mentioned earlier. Importing meat will remain an issue because the African population grows so much. Some countries can export, but others will import. We do need to increase know-how about how to increase livestock production, but we particularly have to transform the smallholder livestock sector, not by getting rid of it, by helping it improve its own efficiency. If we continue to say that Africa should import food, predominantly from Europe, 44 billion for food imports in 2013, the bill doubles every few years. This is one of the projects which the International Livestock Research Institute has pioneered and is now working in 6 countries. And Peter, where are you, Peter? Thank you. Peter from Zimbabwe came to speak to me about doing this in Zimbabwe also. A livestock insurance scheme which is based on real information with real insurance companies that will pay out if the livestock owner has looked at all of the right predictions for the weather, followed it, done the best that he or she can, and it just doesn't work out, there's an insurance claim. This has kept cattle alive and meat production going in countries through this recent period in East Africa where there's been severe drought, just before the severe floods we're now seeing. In Botswana, another example, and I mention this because it's funded by Australia through DFAT to the Australian Centre of International Agricultural Research, where they've looked at the competitiveness of Botswanan industries, removal of foot and mouth disease from the country so that they can then export to the EU. These are major economic developments for countries. Now, Botswana's in a fortunate position. Zimbabwe, we hope, is moving into a more fortunate position now. There's been major successes from projects there, again funded by ACR, funded through DFAT in Australia, working with African scientists to do things which are not immediately obvious if you're the farmer and have been doing a thing traditionally, throwing a waste product away or using it for insulation to keep moisture in your crop. In fact, it's better to feed that to your animals and use the manure back on the crop and use some other matters for the mulching over the crops. Very simple things, and they're done by working with social scientists, agricultural scientists and others. Nobody does it by themselves. The opportunities for livestock development in Africa are still huge, but they're not all positive. So we know that we need it for food and nutritional security. We need it for those young children who are being severely disadvantaged. But overconsumption is already a problem in the cities. We know that economic development is a major step forward from livestock, but we don't get the equity that we want out of those projects. We know that it improves human health, but we also know that animal products are sometimes dangerous to eat if they're not stored well, and we know that diseases spread from animals to humans are a major rising threat. The last thing I would like to mention is about biosciences for Eastern and Central Africa, Becker. The Becker ILRI Hub is African scientists of international standing who are working together, based in our laboratories in Nairobi, but working for all over Africa, people coming from all African countries to study and research there on problems related to Africa. Now, there are also other people from other parts of the world. There's American, there's European scientists, but not so many of those. But they're coming in to work under the auspices of this African research organisation, which is jointly sponsored by ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, and the African Union. This is the future. African scientists working on African problems, African scientists, or Australian scientists, if you like, of African background, working on African problems or Australian problems that relate to Africa, and putting that together in packages that benefit Africa, and if it's from here, it will benefit Australia too. So I've talked about sustainable development, and I hope I've given a very brief context of what can be sustainable. We've got to work together and look at everything on an integrated basis. We also need to ask ourselves, are we dreaming? Are we trying to do something that everybody says we should do and have a perfect world when we know the world is never perfect? It's always subject to change. So we are just making small improvements. Anything we do is a small improvement on which somebody else builds. And that's our role here, to take that step. We'll live for a certain time, do what we do, someone else will do something else. That's how we got here, that's how it will go on. It's not a matter of someone having the answer. Too many of these conferences, I hear people have the silver bullet that will solve the problem. It doesn't happen. I've given some examples here from agribusiness, agriculture, and the international agricultural research. I hope this is roughly something that we can work on together, the Australian African community working for Africa for the benefit of Australia at the same time. Thank you.